Sandy believes in community participation, as you well know. And so she asked us to discuss prostitution at the end of the show. If you've just sat for 3 hours, I'm not sure how long we'll go. But we'll give you kind of a taste of two worlds, the old one and the new one. We just start. I'm, of course, Leo Morgan. I've known Max since more than a decade. And she has worked very hard on some legislation in California. It's been fun to watch her get out there and fight. She's the founder and still president of the Erotic Service Providers Union of San Francisco.
All right.
That's quite a title.
We also hoped to invite, or have here, Chief Mark Mew of the Anchorage Police Department, or someone he selected from his force, so that we could learn more about the enforcement philosophy here in Anchorage and perhaps get some current statistics. Mew's spokesman, Lieutenant David Parker, responded that the chief had other plans. He also added that the folks at the APD usually encounter human trafficking issues in dealing with prostitution in Anchorage and see the physical and emotional toll it takes on prostitute victims. And when I suggested many in the trade did not see themselves as victims, Lieutenant Parker assured me everyone in prostitution was a victim. And maybe that's a good basis for a little discussion tonight. A few historical facts to set things up. At the beginning of the Alaska-Yukon gold rush, and most of them in our area in the far north, men usually outnumbered women about 10 to 1. The cost of living at that period was $6 a day. The most a woman could make legitimately was $5. Do the math. A number of our women, we believe, were amateurs, not professional prostitutes. That, well, we know some of them came up with a husband, a father, a brother, and that person couldn't make it, stayed, died, whatever, and the woman was left on her own. And I think some of them had the same thought I did when I got here from New England. Mother is 5,000 miles away and she'll never find out. I'll get in and get out and see what happens. The Fairbanks line is particularly interesting because it was started by Episcopal preacher Archdeacon Stuck. He had seen the miners coming into camp, and what prostitutes were there had pimps, and the miners were being rolled and murdered and treated badly, and he had been in Texas cattle towns where there was no law, and he thought, So he laid out the red light district for Anchorage. Imagine an Episcopal priest doing that. He wrote the ground rules, and he got land that the prostitutes were allowed to purchase at very reasonable prices. So perhaps for the very first time a girl could work safely without a pimp. And it was a remarkable era in Alaska. I think we started something. Tell us how the world's oldest profession stands today and why you are an activist.
Well, thank you, Lael. I think that the play and Lael's work deserves a special round of applause. I'm a big Lael Morgan fan, and I so appreciate having the history documented in an impartial way that we can all have access to it, and to see it portrayed in this play, in this musical, was just an overwhelming, beautiful experience for us that got to come and watch it on opening night, and I hope that it was for you as well. I always want to say a special hello to anybody in the room who may have worked in the sex industry, or maybe somebody who is related to somebody who worked in the sex industry. I think that at the turn of the century, we saw the criminalization of prostitution that resulted in the actual people involved in the sex industry not be able to speak out and admit that they were in fact in the sex industry. So I always want to say a special hello to anybody who may have worked as a stripper or you know, in some capacity as a sex worker, as we say these days. So yeah, I founded the Erotic Service Providers Union for people who earn a living with their erotic labor, people who are prostitutes in any capacity, street-based workers, home-based workers, agency workers, strippers, adult film actors, pornography, webcamming, as you may or may not know, is the fastest growing part of the sex industry today. And there's a lot of crossover for people. So that's kind of the group that we work on organizing, and we work on actually repealing the criminalization of prostitution laws, because those laws violate our First Amendment right to free speech. To be able, as Lael said, in the city of Anchorage, it's actually a criminal misdemeanor offense to say that you are practicing prostitution here. So as a result of that kind of situation, you have people who can't gain access to rights that you have, the right to have equal protection under the law, for example. So as we saw in the play here, you know, our very unique situation at the turn of the century, where women were actually able to own businesses, which was phenomenal back then for women who didn't even have the right to vote. So at the time of this play that takes place, and a lot of the documentation that Lael does, you know, women did not have the right to own property. So they had to have men in their lives in order to gain access to the property to be able to conduct business. And unfortunately, a lot of the anti-prostitution laws were passed prior to women having the right to vote. So since women were the majority that make up the people in the sex industry, they didn't have access to say, wait a minute, don't criminalize my workspace. And that's generally how the abatement of the Red Light District Act started, is it criminalized the workers' space where the workers actually worked. And a lot of those spaces were owned by men because men could own property, and it was more difficult for women to own property. So, you know, 100 years later, a lot of those old draconian, archaic laws are still on the books, but they have new forms that they take.
I should tell you that in writing the book, which took me researching about 30 years, I interviewed about 200 men who knew women on the line, particularly in Fairbanks, because Fairbanks line lasted through World War II. And every one of them I interviewed in Alaska had been the paper boy. They'd fixed the plumbing, they'd done the roof. But they never had anything physically to do with the ladies of the evening. And this is like 200. Finally, I go to a Pioneer convention in Dawson. And, you know, I'm getting the same old, except for one guy who said, oh, yeah, every second Thursday. But I'm thinking, you know, with that kind of approach, those girls could have made no money at all, and we know they did. So maybe, like, you don't know who has worked in the trade in our audience or anywhere today, because it's something you can't talk about. I think that probably we're more customers than we know about too.
Absolutely.
I looked at there's a wonderful webpage that has all the state laws for all the states on prostitution, and it's a misdemeanor here, right, if you're picked up as a prostitute. In some states it's a felony. If it's a felony, you can't vote, you can't fly, you can't do a lot of things, which is pretty steep. So I was feeling pretty good about Alaska, at least for a misdemeanor, right? But if you run a house in Alaska, it's a felony if you're prosecuted for being a madam. Now, if, and heaven forbid anyone would even think of it, if you were going to go to work as a lady of the evening, where would you rather work? All by yourself out there? Looking for customers, or in a well-organized house where you've got a madam who knows how to protect you. I think it's very strange that that should carry one whopping big penalty.